The developments described in this report unfold against the backdrop of one of the most serious diplomatic crises in the history of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. What initially appeared to be another episode of rhetorical tension has, within a matter of days, evolved into a broader structural challenge to the transatlantic alliance. Following a series of contentious public remarks attributed to President Donald Trump, NATO has entered a period of operational strain. Rather than limiting their response to formal statements or symbolic gestures, several allied governments have begun to reassess their strategic and economic dependencies on the United States. The resulting actions suggest not a temporary diplomatic dispute, but a recalibration of long-standing assumptions about alliance reliability. The narrative that NATO is merely experiencing political turbulence is increasingly difficult to sustain. According to the analysis presented, the alliance is facing functional paralysis in key areas, including coordination, trust, and long-term planning. At the same time, the United States is described as withdrawing from a significant number of international institutions while maintaining elevated tariff barriers against close partners. These parallel developments have amplified concerns among allies regarding predictability and commitment. In response, governments are not pursuing confrontation through military means, nor are they seeking formal legal mechanisms to exclude the United States from existing institutions. Instead, they appear to be engaging in what can be described as strategic bypassing, the construction of alternative economic and diplomatic frameworks that reduce reliance on Washington as a central node. This analysis frames the current moment not as a sudden collapse, but as an inflection point. The combination of rhetorical escalation, policy divergence, and institutional withdrawal has accelerated trends that were previously moving slowly beneath the surface. As a result, the question confronting NATO members is no longer whether the alliance is under strain, but how they should adapt if the assumptions that sustained it for decades no longer hold. The immediate catalyst for the current escalation can be traced to remarks made by President Donald Trump during a televised interview in which he questioned the role of NATO allies in the war in Afghanistan. In seeking to justify a more isolationist posture and renewed threats of withdrawal from the alliance, the president asserted that several allied nations had remained largely removed from frontline combat operations while U.S. forces bore the primary burden of the conflict. While such statements may have been intended to reinforce a domestic political narrative, their international impact proved profound. For allied governments, the issue was not merely one of historical interpretation, but of collective memory and moral recognition. Military participation in Afghanistan has long been a politically sensitive subject in Europe, where deployments were frequently contested at home and justified primarily through alliance solidarity rather than direct national interest. Publicly available casualty data directly contradicted the implication that Allied forces had avoided combat. The United Kingdom, Canada, Germany, Denmark, and other NATO members sustained significant losses over the course of the conflict, with many of their forces operating in some of the most volatile regions of the country. These sacrifices form a central component of how alliance contributions are understood within national political discourse. The response from European leaders reflected this sensitivity. Senior officials in the United Kingdom and Germany departed from customary diplomatic restraint to issue unusually direct public rebukes. Their objections focused less on tone than on substance, arguing that dismissing Allied casualties undermines the principle of shared risk that underpins collective defense. From a strategic perspective, the remarks struck at a foundational element of NATO's cohesion, the belief that alliance commitments are reciprocal and that sacrifices made by one member are recognized and respected by others. When that belief is called into question by the political leadership of the alliance's most powerful member, it creates uncertainty that extends well beyond a single controversy. In this sense, the Afghanistan comments functioned less as an isolated provocation than as a signal event. They reinforced existing concerns among allies about whether the United States continues to view NATO as a mutual security community or increasingly as a transactional arrangement subject to shifting political calculations. The controversy surrounding the Afghanistan remarks quickly evolved into a broader debate about the credibility of NATO's core security guarantee. At the center of this debate lies Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, which establishes that an armed attack against one member is to be considered an attack against all. While often treated as a legal commitment, Article 5 functions in practice as a political promise sustained by trust rather than enforcement mechanisms. For European governments, the issue raised by the president's statements was not limited to historical accuracy or diplomatic etiquette. It was interpreted as a test of whether the United States continues to value the principle of shared sacrifice that gives Article 5 its meaning. Collective defense depends on the assumption that past contributions, particularly those involving loss of life, are acknowledged as part of a common security effort. When Allied casualties are publicly minimized or dismissed, the reassurance embedded in Article 5 weakens. Even in the absence of formal policy changes, such rhetoric introduces doubt about how future crises might be interpreted in Washington. Would commitments be honored unconditionally or recalculated in light of domestic political considerations? For alliance partners, this uncertainty represents a strategic risk in itself. This erosion of confidence has tangible implications. NATO deterrence rests not only on military capability, but on the perceived unity of its members. If adversaries conclude that alliance cohesion is fracturing, the deterrent effect of collective defense may diminish regardless of force levels or readiness. European policymakers are acutely aware that ambiguity surrounding U.S. resolve could invite miscalculation by external actors. As a result, the focus among Allied capitals began to shift. Rather than debating whether the comments required an apology or clarification, governments increasingly treated them as confirmation of a deeper structural problem. The concern was no longer whether relations could be stabilized in the short term, but whether reliance on U.S.-led guarantees remained a viable long-term strategy under conditions of political unpredictability. In this context, Article 5 emerged not as a fixed anchor, but as a contingent commitment, one whose effectiveness depends on sustained political consensus. Once that consensus appears fragile, the alliance is compelled to consider alternative forms of security reassurance beyond its traditional framework. As confidence in the reliability of transatlantic guarantees began to erode, European policymakers accelerated efforts to diversify both economic and strategic partnerships. What had previously been a gradual, often stalled process of engagement with India rapidly assumed greater urgency. The conclusion of the EU-India trade agreement in late January 2026 must therefore be understood not as a routine commercial development, but as a strategic response to shifting geopolitical conditions. Negotiations between Brussels and New Delhi had extended intermittently over nearly 2 decades, hindered by disagreements over tariffs, market access, and regulatory standards. India's traditionally protectionist economic posture made comprehensive liberalization politically difficult. Yet the timing of the agreement's finalization suggests that external pressures, particularly uncertainty surrounding U.S. trade policy and alliance commitments, played a decisive role in breaking the deadlock. The scale of the agreement reflects this urgency. By eliminating tariffs on the vast majority of European exports to India, the deal offers European manufacturers immediate access to one of the fastest-growing consumer markets in the world. Sectors such as automotive manufacturing, industrial machinery, pharmaceuticals, and luxury goods stand to benefit significantly, particularly as European firms face increasing barriers in the U.S. market due to elevated tariffs. From a strategic perspective, the agreement serves multiple functions. Economically, it mitigates exposure to transatlantic trade disruption by redirecting growth toward Asia. Politically, it signals that Europe is prepared to pursue prosperity independently of Washington's preferences. Symbolically, it underscores a broader recalibration of alliances in which economic integration becomes a substitute for diminishing political certainty. India, for its part, gains preferential access to European markets at a moment when its exporters are confronting rising trade barriers elsewhere. The reciprocal nature of the agreement reflects a convergence of interests rather than ideological alignment. For both sides, diversification has become a hedge against volatility rather than a statement of exclusion. In this context, the EU-India deal functions as an early indicator of a more profound shift. Rather than attempting to repair strained relations through diplomacy alone, European leaders appear to be investing in alternative partnerships capable of sustaining economic growth and strategic relevance, even in the absence of stable transatlantic leadership. The strategic realignment described above carries significant economic implications, particularly for the United States. While much public attention has focused on tariffs as instruments of leverage, the more consequential effect may be the gradual redirection of trade flows away from American markets, a phenomenon economists describe as trade diversion. When two major economic blocs reduce barriers between themselves while maintaining or increasing barriers against a third-party commercial activity naturally shifts toward the path of least resistance. The EU-India agreement creates precisely such conditions. European producers gain preferential access to Indian consumers while U.S. exporters continue to face elevated tariffs. Over time, this disparity alters purchasing decisions, supply chains, and long-term investment strategies. Agricultural markets illustrate this dynamic clearly. American farmers have historically relied on export demand to absorb surplus production. As European producers obtain tariff-free entry into the Indian market US, agricultural exports become relatively less competitive. Even marginal differences in pricing can have outsized effects in commodity markets, where buyers prioritize cost efficiency and reliability over political considerations. The impact extends beyond agriculture. Industrial goods, consumer products, and advanced manufacturing sectors face similar pressures. Once European firms establish brand presence, distribution networks, and regulatory familiarity in India, barriers to entry for latecomers increase substantially. Market share lost in emerging economies is often difficult to reclaim, even if trade conditions later improve. From a macroeconomic perspective, these shifts do not produce immediate crises. Instead, they manifest as slower growth, reduced export revenues, and diminished influence over global standards and norms. This incremental erosion can be more damaging than a sudden shock, as it unfolds quietly while alternatives consolidate. For U.S. policymakers, the central risk lies not in isolation per se, but in exclusion from the fastest-growing corridors of global trade. As partners deepen integration elsewhere, the opportunity cost of standing apart increases. In this sense, the economic consequences of diplomatic friction are cumulative rather than instantaneous, shaping competitive outcomes years into the future rather than weeks or months. Despite widespread references to a ban, the developments under discussion do not involve formal legal mechanisms to remove the United States from NATO or other multilateral institutions. Such actions would be procedurally complex and politically costly for all parties involved. Instead, the emerging pattern reflects a subtler form of marginalization that operates through practice rather than statute, what may be described as informal exclusion or a soft ban. In contemporary geopolitics, influence is often exercised through networks rather than rules. Decisions about intelligence, sharing, supply chain, routing, regulatory alignment, and summit coordination are shaped as much by trust and predictability as by treaty obligations. When confidence in a partner declines, these networks can be quietly reconfigured without public confrontation. Evidence of this dynamic can be observed in the evolving behavior of allied governments. High-level consultations increasingly occur in smaller formats, with key decisions prepared in advance of larger multilateral meetings. Trade and investment initiatives are designed to minimize exposure to policy volatility, even when such volatility has not yet materialized into concrete withdrawal. In this environment, formal participation becomes less meaningful if substantive coordination takes place elsewhere. The concept of a soft ban therefore captures a shift in relevance rather than membership. The United States remains present within existing institutions, but its role as a central convening power diminishes as alternatives develop. Over time, this process can reduce agenda-setting authority and limit the ability to shape outcomes, even without explicit exclusion. This mode of marginalization carries strategic advantages for those employing it. By avoiding overt confrontation, allies preserve legal continuity and domestic political flexibility while adapting to perceived risks. The cost of adjustment is distributed, gradually lowering the likelihood of escalation. For the sidelined actor, however, the consequences are cumulative and difficult to reverse once new patterns become entrenched. In this sense, the soft ban is not an endpoint but a process. It reflects a recalibration of relationships driven by uncertainty rather than hostility, and it underscores how modern alliances can weaken not through formal dissolution but through the steady redistribution of trust and initiative. As informal exclusion takes shape, European policymakers have increasingly emphasized the concept of strategic autonomy. Long discussed within EU institutions as a theoretical aspiration, strategic autonomy is now being reframed as a practical necessity. The uncertainty surrounding U.S. commitments has accelerated efforts to ensure that Europe can protect its economic and security interests independently, or at least without assuming consistent American leadership. This shift is evident in the scope of recent agreements and policy initiatives. The EU-India partnership, while framed publicly as a trade accord, includes provisions for cooperation in areas traditionally reserved for close security allies. These include maritime security in the Indo-Pacific, cyber defense, critical infrastructure protection, and coordination on emerging technologies. Such domains were previously anchored in transatlantic frameworks, underscoring the significance of Europe's recalibration. For India, this engagement aligns with its own strategic diversification. While New Delhi has maintained close ties with the United States through arrangements such as the Quad, it has also expressed concern about exposure to abrupt policy changes, including tariffs, visa restrictions, and shifting diplomatic priorities. Deepening cooperation with Europe offers India a broader base of support and reduces dependence on any single external partner. The broader implication is a gradual redistribution of security dialogue. Issues once discussed primarily within NATO or US-led coalitions are increasingly addressed in alternative forums. This does not necessarily signal the abandonment of existing alliances, but it does dilute their exclusivity and centrality. Over time, this diffusion may reshape how collective security is organized, particularly in regions where European and Asian interests intersect. Strategic autonomy in this context does not imply isolationism or antagonism toward the United States. Rather, it reflects a hedging strategy designed to preserve continuity in an era of political unpredictability. By investing in diversified partnerships, European states seek to maintain influence and resilience regardless of fluctuations in transatlantic relations. This evolution suggests that the architecture of global security is becoming more pluralistic. Power and coordination are no longer concentrated within a single alliance structure, but distributed across overlapping networks. The United States remains a significant actor within this system, but its position as the primary hub is increasingly contested by the emergence of parallel frameworks. An additional dimension shaping current tensions lies in the Arctic, where questions of sovereignty, access, and long-term strategic positioning have become increasingly salient. What has often been framed in public discourse as an unconventional diplomatic dispute over Greenland reflects deeper concerns about control over emerging maritime routes, critical minerals, and future energy resources. As polar ice recedes, the Arctic is transitioning from a peripheral region into a central theater of geopolitical competition. New shipping lanes promise shorter transit times between Europe and Asia, while untapped reserves of rare earths, hydrocarbons, and other strategic materials have elevated the region's economic importance. For Arctic and near-Arctic states, these developments have intensified sensitivities around sovereignty and external influence. In this context, renewed U.S. interest in Greenland has been interpreted by European and Nordic governments not merely as rhetorical excess, but as a signal of assertive intent. Denmark, a NATO ally with formal sovereignty over Greenland, has viewed such overtures as undermining established norms of alliance, respect, and consultation. The resulting unease has extended beyond Copenhagen, affecting perceptions in Sweden, Finland, and Norway, all of which regard Arctic stability as integral to their national security. Rather than reinforcing confidence in U.S. leadership, these developments have heightened concerns about unpredictability. For smaller states, the distinction between protection and pressure can become blurred when alliance dynamics appear increasingly transactional. As a result, Nordic countries have accelerated coordination within European defense frameworks and EU-led initiatives, further reducing reliance on US-centric structures. The Arctic case illustrates a broader pattern identified throughout this analysis. Strategic geography magnifies political signaling. Actions or statements that might once have been dismissed as symbolic acquire greater weight when tied to regions of rising economic and security value. In this environment, even speculative claims can generate lasting diplomatic consequences. Taken together, the Arctic and Greenland episode reinforces the perception that alliance strains are not confined to rhetoric or trade, but extend into domains where long-term strategic planning is essential. As partners seek to insulate themselves from uncertainty, regional cooperation increasingly substitutes for assumptions of unconditional transatlantic leadership. Taken together, the developments examined in the preceding sections point toward a pattern of systemic adjustment rather than a single act of rupture. There has been no formal expulsion of the United States from NATO, nor any legal declaration of exclusion from the Western alliance architecture. Yet the cumulative effect of rhetorical conflict, policy divergence, and strategic recalibration suggests an outcome that closely resembles isolation in practice, if not in name. This process is best understood as emergent rather than intentional. Allied governments have not coordinated a unified strategy to marginalize Washington. Instead, they have responded independently to perceived risks by diversifying partnerships, redesigning trade routes, and rebalancing security dependencies. These decisions taken individually appear pragmatic and defensive. Collectively, however, they produce a structural shift in which the United States occupies a less central role in shaping economic and strategic outcomes. The EU-India agreement serves as a case study in this transformation. Its scale and timing reflect not hostility toward the United States, but a determination to reduce vulnerability to political unpredictability. Similarly, Europe's renewed emphasis on strategic autonomy and regional defense coordination reflects a logic of self-preservation rather than ideological opposition. In this sense, the United States has not been overtly rejected. It has been quietly planned around. From a historical perspective, this pattern aligns with how great powers tend to lose influence. Decline rarely occurs through dramatic confrontation or decisive defeat. More often, it unfolds through incremental decisions by partners who seek stability elsewhere when leadership appears inconsistent. The loss of agenda-setting power precedes the loss of formal authority. The central question raised by these developments is therefore not whether the United States remains powerful, but whether it remains indispensable. Alliances endure when members believe that participation is both reliable and mutually beneficial. When that belief weakens, even without formal dissolution, cooperation migrates to alternative frameworks capable of delivering predictability. In this context, the notion that NATO is broken should be interpreted with caution. The alliance continues to exist and its institutional structures remain intact. What has changed is the assumption that it alone constitutes the primary platform for Western coordination. As new economic and security arrangements take shape, NATO risks becoming one forum among many rather than the central pillar of collective action. Ultimately, the outcome described here forces a reframing of responsibility. The question is no longer whether allies have abandoned the United States, but whether U.S. policy choices have accelerated a process in which others feel compelled to adapt. In global politics, isolation is seldom imposed. More often, it is the unintended consequence of partners learning how to function without waiting for a single leader to set the direction.